What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in today's episode is Kaiser Kuo. Besides having probably the coolest name of any guest I've ever had on the show before, Kaiser is also the host and co-founder of the Sinica podcast, the leading English language podcast on current affairs in China, the editor-at-large of the China Project, a New York-based, China-focused news, information, and business services platform, the former editor of international communications for Baidu, China's leading search engine, and the co-founder and lead guitarist of the seminal Chinese heavy metal band Tang Dynasty. I asked Kaiser to come on the podcast today because I have felt for some time that my coverage of China has been too narrowly focused on U.S. national security concerns and the concerns of investors and businesses as they pertain to the Chinese economy and in particular, its technology sector. I'm acutely aware of just how little I know about the country, and that makes it even more dangerous to speak with people who all share most of the same underlying assumptions, because I'm not in a position to really challenge them. I often listen to Kaiser's podcast precisely because it offers a more circumspect and culturally informed perspective on this incredibly important country. It teaches me things about China's history, the lived experience of its people, their assumptions, values, and beliefs about the world and their place in it that are often caricatured or ignored entirely in Western media. My goal in this conversation has been to harness that perspective in the service of building what Kaiser calls informed empathy, to learn to see ourselves and the world from China's eyes. What do we get wrong when talking about China? What are the central driving forces in Chinese politics? And ultimately, what does China want? What are the ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party and its people? And are those ambitions compatible with our own notions of preeminence and political exceptionalism? While concrete answers to such complex social and political questions are often elusive, grappling with them is essential if we want to find a peaceful way through this very difficult period in U.S.-Sino relations. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener-supported. I don't rely on advertisers or commercial sponsors. So if you want access to the second hour of today's conversation, as well as the transcripts and intelligence reports, which include my takeaways from every episode, as well as my thoughts on what comes next, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and get immediate access to the Hidden Forces premium feed, where you can listen to the rest of today's conversation, as well as additional or subscriber-only content directly from your podcasting app of choice. If you want access to our Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this wonderful and informative conversation with my guest, Kaiser Kuo. Kaiser Kuo, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you very much, Demetri. It's great to be here.
My first question, Kaiser, actually I have two questions that go back. First, is Kaiser your real name? And second, how do I pronounce your last name correctly?
Sure. Kaiser is my real name. I mean, it's on my birth certificate. It's the one that my parents, in their folly, landed on. It's actually kind of a botched patronymic. I mean, it's kind of a bilingual pun, too, because my father's given name is Kai. So his generational name is Jing and his surname is Guo, which also answers the question about how to pronounce my surname. It's Guo Jing Kai was his name. Kai is, his unique name. And so he took Kai and sort of has an apostrophe S and the Chinese word for son, R. So Kai's son. Therefore, Kaiser. It's pretty silly and very convoluted, and nobody gets it, but there we are. Yeah, and so my last name is pronounced Kuo, and I expect most Anglophone people will just say Kuo. That's perfectly fine. My siblings say Kuo. I just can't bring myself to do it myself. I can't say, if my last name were W-A-N-G, I would definitely say Wang and not Wang. If it were C-H-A-N-G, I'd say Zhang and not Chang, but so here I am.
Yeah, I would say that you probably have the coolest name of any guest I've ever had on the podcast. First of all, the name
Kofinas is not a bad name either.
It's not bad, but it's not as cool as Kaiser. That's a pretty cool name. So, Kaiser, before we get into any of this, I've been listening to your podcast for as long as I've been doing this podcast. It's an immensely valuable source of information on China. Always has been. As I've told you, I have immense respect for your professional approach, the way you approach the subject matter that you understand incredibly well, and yet you put some distance between yourself and that subject. So I just find it incredibly useful, and you're the perfect person to talk to today. Before we get into our conversation about not just the latest stuff, the 20th Party Congress, palace intrigue, and et cetera, but also the bigger China questions, which I'm most interested in talking about, I'd like to try to gain a better sense of your own background, because you're one of those folks who, the more I learn about like where you came from and how you got into this business, I realized like you didn't go anywhere near a kind of narrow path. Most of us don't have a clear path to where we are today, but we more or less kind of have some discernible path from A to B to C. You seem to have kind of done a lot of really interesting things. So tell me a little bit about how you got into what you do today.
Yeah, it has a strange internal logic to it, even though it looks like I'm just sort of being, careening around from just these totally disparate career paths. So I started off as an academic, basically. Let me go back a little bit further. So my folks were both born in mainland China, and both of them left in the late 1940s as the communists advanced, and they went to Taiwan. And so they both emigrated to the U.S. separately. They didn't know each other, although the families were connected. They both emigrated to the U.S. in the mid-1950s and met in Columbus, Ohio, and then went on to have a slew of children, 4 of which I am number 2, boy, 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 girl. So I was the one who kind of tried to stand out from my very conspicuously talented siblings by being the one who was interested in China and who wouldn't complain when we'd go to China, and embraced all things Chinese and tried hard to keep my language skills and all that stuff. We grew up, all of us being born in the States, we spoke varying degrees of crappy Chinese, but mine was maybe the least crappy. So I decided to try to parlay that into something. Like I said, I started off on kind of an academic career path. In college at UC Berkeley, I started off doing Russian Soviet studies, but then after a trip to China in '86, midway through college, I sort of saw the trajectory that China was on, and I decided I really needed to sort of hitch myself to that was going to be the most exciting thing happening in the world for most of my working life. And so I decided I needed to have a front row seat. And so my first way to try to get that front row seat, was to conspire to create a Chinese rock band. And so initially my band in Berkeley, it was called Freefall. It was kind of a progressive rock band, sort of think, Yes, Genesis, King Crimson, that sort of thing. We were invited to go to China to play. And even though that didn't end up happening, as soon as I graduated in '88, I just sped over to China as soon as I could under the guise of studying Chinese. But in fact, I went there with no real intention of formal studying. I was there just to have a visa and an excuse to be there, that my parents would buy. And then immediately set about finding the other long-haired rock musicians in town. I knew they were there. I sort of knew because of that whole back and forth talking with the organizers of our abortive tour. And I ended up meeting them pretty quickly, so got immersed into the burgeoning Chinese hard rock heavy metal scene. And so that was really my baptism. And it happened that while we were putting my first, major band together, Tang Dynasty, in 1989, the former general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Hu Yaobang, up and died on April 15th. And that set in motion what would become the Tiananmen demonstrations and, the eventual crackdown on June 4th, all of which up until the morning of June 3rd, I was witness to. So I was just basically baffled by what was happening. I realized that there was this kind of richly symbolic language that was being deployed in and around the square in everything that the official side and the student-led side were doing, and that I didn't understand the language. I understood the words that were spoken, but I didn't understand the valence of the historical references they were making and all that sort of thing. And so when I got back from China after '89, I just decided I'm going to plunge into trying to figure out what it was that I had just witnessed. And so I did a master's degree first at the University of Arizona and was, persuaded to stay on for a PhD. But in the meantime, in 1995, we had a tragic death of one of the bandmates of mine in China. And the remaining bandmates persuaded me to drop my PhD program and come back to China to rejoin the band, which I then did and ended up staying for 20 years. Not in the band, only played in the band for another 3 years through 1999. And then weirdly, I was, trying to figure out whether I was going to go back to the States and finish my PhD, or whether I was going to stay in China and start another band, or what I was going to do. And I kind of took stock one night with my laptop open on my desk in my parents' room. At the same time I left that band, I broke up with a girlfriend, so I was staying at my parents' house. It was really kind of embarrassing. And just as I was heading down the stairs, because my mom had told me my scrambled eggs were ready, the next morning I got a phone call, and the very job I had kind of dreamt up the night before I went to bed after leaving the band materialized, almost like I had willed it into existence. I got this phone call from Marcus Broccoli, who was later the national editor of the Wall Street Journal, but he had been the bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal in Shanghai. I'm sorry, he was at the Washington Post later. He had invested in an internet startup, and they were looking for an English editor-in-chief. And so he tapped me. I mean, we knew each other socially. He knew I was well-connected and was, a decent writer. So I got tapped for that job, and the next week I interviewed for it, and I was working there. It was fantastic. So that led me to career in editorial and in journalism, which I did for most of the 2000s. After that company imploded, I worked mainly writing about technology in China for a whole slew of different publications, and eventually getting a full-time job at a Silicon Valley magazine called Red Herring. You might remember Red Herring. I mean, you're probably too young, but back in the day in the Valley, it was like, thick as a phone book, and it was kind of the tech Bible. But then I was working for its second coming, which was this miserably thin publication printed on, kind of crappy paper. Fortunately, that did open a lot of doors for me. And when you become a fairly successful tech writer, a lot of the internet companies in China, they want to hire you to do communications because they figure you know how the game is played, you sort of have credibility with the journalists, and kind of know your way around the internet scene in China. So I got hired first by Youku and then by Baidu, and I spent 6 years at Baidu as their director of international communications. And along the way, in 2010, I had started the Sinica podcast with my very good friend, Jeremy Goldkorn. We had both been kicking around in China for 15 years by then. And 6 years later, in 2016, just as I was thinking about moving back to the States, this little media company, then called SupChina, now called the China Project, made an offer to acquire our podcast and to bring us on full time as, sort of in an acqui-hire. Jeremy eventually to run all our print editorial products, and me to run our audio products. So Sinica became the flagship of a new network called the Sinica Network that's now under the China Project. And we, at our peak, had 9 shows. We're down to about 7 shows right now, but we're very proud of those.
Man, so many questions to ask you now. So while this conversation is supposed to be about China, I still do want to ask you some things. First of all, what did you originally want your PhD to be in?
So it was so the program was in East Asian studies, but I was really interested in 2 things. I was interested in intellectual history, and I was interested in politics. So the dissertation topic that I had landed on was a little of each. It was really about the emergence of technocracy in post-Mao China, but it had a very kind of historically grounded thesis. The idea was that we could find discernible roots of the technocratic mindset in the imperial civil service examination system, in the whole sort of posture of the Chinese political culture toward, knowledge elites, toward intellectuals. And my argument was basically that the reason why China was able to become the most thoroughly technocratic regime in the world, with the possible exception of Singapore, and that would happen so unremarked upon within China, was that it felt sort of natural, that it was this sort of natural cultural fit, that it did not surprise anyone that in the 1980s and in the 1990s, engineers should be somehow viewed as uniquely qualified to hold political office.
Engineers, as in what kind of engineers? And when you talk
civil,
about, because usually when we think about technocracy, we're talking about social engineering. We're not talking about like physical engineering. So can you square that circle for me?
Yeah, so actually the definition that I was using, and I can't remember who it was that I borrowed this from, was a technocrat in this sense is somebody who is a putative or actual holder of political office who has a 4-year degree or more in the natural sciences or engineering. So we are talking in the most literal sense. We're not talking about economists. We're not talking about, the engineers of the soul that people would later write about. We're talking really, literally about people who have their grounding in the natural sciences and in China's case, mostly in engineering. So chemical engineering, hydrological engineering, electrical engineering, civil.
So in that sense, Chinese people were well suited socially and politically to take advantage of this kind of thrust into, quote, modernity, so to speak, and embrace technology. Is that what you're suggesting?
So it goes in both directions, that they understood that basically weighting that skill set would be conducive to China's entry into modernity, but also, the other way around, that, so yeah, I think you get what I'm trying to say there.
Yeah, well, because the other thing that I'm thinking about too, which is something that you've remarked on as well, and I'm thinking of it now, which is that retrospectively, when you look back over the last 40 years, China has also had remarkable levels of success embracing technology and, quote, again, modernity. And change has been a positive force in Chinese society. Whereas in American society and in European society, there are large swaths of the population that have seen change as threatening.
That's
and
right.
I wonder how important of a role is that, and that distinction for us to try to understand as part of the, quote, global West. This is actually a new term that's being used now. But I guess specifically Westerners, how important is that in trying to understand China?
Demetri, I absolutely love this question. I think that you've put your finger on something super, super important. It's something I talk about all the time. I would suggest that right now in China and in the West, there are quite different attitudes about technology and its role in futurity, right? In the West, as you say, there's a lot of misgiving about it. We are in a moment right now, and we've been there for some time now, where we are deeply worried about the impact that technological advancement and in change more generally has brought. If you look at our science fiction, for example, we seem unable to sort of imagine bright futures that aren't kind of overshadowed with kind of look, most of what we create are dystopias now in our science fiction. I think that we are very much in the Anglophone West in our Black Mirror phase, right? I mean, this is a line I've used for laughs otherwise, but China is still very much in its Star Trek phase. So there is a very different attitude, and part of this has to do with, I think, the technocratic nature of leadership in China. Part of it has to do, as you completely correctly identified, with that lived experience that in the last 40 or 50 years, basically as the device on your desk or in your pocket, in your palm, has improved, so has material life. So it's pretty easy for people to see this kind of advancement in lockstep of everything getting better and, technology improving. So there's very little skepticism. I mean, I would point out that in public discourse about things like artificial intelligence, you don't find major Chinese scientists, major Chinese technologists who are, worried about armies of killer robots and about AI taking over and distorting our lives. There's this acceptance, if you accept as evidence, that the public discourse around it is conspicuously free of any of that kind of scaremongering. Whereas in the United States, and I think not without good reason, there's a lot of, you think about our major technologists, people like Elon Musk or Bill Gates, who are talking about, the dangers of AI. There's a lot of conversation about AI ethics. There's a lot of worry about, again, I think that this is very appropriate, about what social ills might come of technology. That is way, way more than you see. The Stephen Hawkings of China do not talk about this. They're all kind of all in on it. So yeah, it's a very, very different posture.
So to follow that thread, is that also true on a geopolitical level? And maybe the reason is because the United States has been either a global superpower in the context of a bipolar world or the unipolar power for the last, 70 years, 80 years, that this also informs our concerns or our perspective on change and focusing very much on the threats that change poses because we dominate the status quo and international political institutions are so really have been born out of the period of American hegemony. And therefore, China's rise also represents a threat in that regard. I mean, talk to me about that, the geopolitical aspect of change and how we think about it versus how the Chinese think about it.
Sure. I think that the United States is both threatened in that sense that it has this sort of long-held hegemony and it values that. It wants to, kind of maintain American primacy. And so, of course, it feels vulnerable on the technology flank. That's part of the reason why you see so many of the efforts that we've seen coming out of both the Trump and now the Biden administration focused on kind of kneecapping Chinese technology. But at the same time, I think there's an understanding that American primacy itself is in large part derived from the ability of American technology to disrupt. So we understand it as a double-edged sword.
We as in we Americans.
We Americans, exactly. So I know I have kind of a slippery we, but I usually mean we Americans, right? So we Americans, we understand that our technological edge has delivered to us, our economic edge and our geostrategic edge. So we, even while we recognize that and why we emphasize, how many times have you heard just in the last 10 years, just how we need to invest more heavily in STEM, right? I mean, we're obsessed with it, but we are also quite scared of it. And we recognize that insofar as there's the threat coming from China, it's on that flank.
Yeah, I love that you brought up disruption because that's actually something that we tend to be very comfortable with. Of course, disruption itself, when taken to certain extremes in American society, can cause a political backlash, and I think we have seen that. But I'm curious how the Chinese view disruption. And when I say the Chinese, clearly the leadership in China doesn't want disruption. They want to be able to control disruption in order to grow the economy, innovation, all the good things. But obviously they don't want political disruption. But I'm curious how Chinese people in general see that and how they think about things like privacy, centralization of power, things that in the US are so many people just see as universally bad, centralization that is, and privacy as universally good. I'm curious how Chinese people view those things.
Right. I think you've answered the question just in the way that you phrased it. And you're absolutely right. There is a fear, and it's not just within the leadership itself, but in the living memory of so many Chinese today, there's a memory of periods of chaos. A friend of mine once commented that when we Americans, when we put our sort of nightmare scenarios together for the movies or for fiction, we constantly reinvent, Hitler and the SS, the stormtroopers. If you look at, Star Wars or anything, it's always jackbooted, kind of uniform. In the case of Star Wars, they're actual literal clones of one another. This excess of, this surfeit of authoritarian control, that's our big national nightmare. In China, the national nightmare, I credit Jeremiah Jenny, who's a brilliant friend of mine who lives in Beijing, saying the Chinese national nightmare is entirely the opposite. It conjures up, periods of national fracture, of warlordism, of chaos, and the ensuing, four horsemen that come from that, right? The poverty and even the starvation. So very different. And so there's a fear of that kind of disruption. And at the same time, there is, and I think nobody can doubt this, an embrace of technological disruption. It's almost become kind of a fetish object in China to talk about being disruptive, the way that the Valley talked about it maybe a decade ago. This basically accords with their lived experience. They have been able to enjoy kind of non-damaging technological disruption that has basically delivered better lives. And they recognize that that's been possible because of this context of political stability, because their political lives have not been upended or disrupted. They've been able to sort of pursue the kind of healthy disruption of technology and, the economy without the downside, right?
I think also something else that's often lost on us, because it's like that thing about the fish in the water, has the water. We're just living
Right.
it. America,
David Foster Wallace. Yeah.
yeah, you can't overstate enough the impact that our geographic security has had on our culture and our openness. And this is also true of seafaring nations in general. And the U.S. has been primarily a naval power before it became anything else, versus continental powers that deal with tons of geographic terrestrial threats.
Right.
The former can be more open to the world and benefit from that type of commercial relationship and flowering decentralization, whereas continental powers that have insecure borders have to be much more centralized and are constantly trying to exert some level of authority over this very, very difficult territory to hold. I also wondered, this is another question I have now, it comes up as I think about this, which is that it does seem very much like the Chinese leadership is deeply concerned / obsessed with creating some kind of clearly delineated, contiguous sense of Chinese nationhood, culture, tying up loose ends, whether that's Taiwan or Hong Kong or Tibet or other, let's say, physical territories of the country. At least that's the perspective I have from encountering the subject as a Westerner. How accurate is that picture in your view? And how relevant and important is that to understanding China? The sense of like wanting to define China from the top down.
Yeah, this is one of the great projects. This has been something that has been, as I think you rightly say, kind of an obsession with them. They believe themselves to still be undergoing this kind of process of national construction. And part of what they lament, and I've heard this many times, is that some of these processes that in other countries, if you think about Italy, if you think about, where you've had to build a nation from sort of this vociferous group of separate identities, it's not a pretty process. It's quite an ugly process. It sometimes means, really stamping out or quashing the kind of national self-determination, desires of quite distinct ethnic groups. It's horrible. It's ugly. Inevitably results in gross violations of human rights as we understand them. And they kind of lament that other countries got to do that in an age before satellite communications and before 24-hour cable and the internet. This, they think, is happening in China under the pitiless glare of international attention, where a set of norms and values that is seen as sort of universal by many of the nations of the developed West was then, is now being violated. And so, yeah, they feel like it's somewhat unfair. And this is what kind of lies behind a lot of the whataboutism.
You're saying it's unfair that the rest of
we
the
are
world,
doing the same thing that you did.
Right. Whether it's industrialization, pollution, whether it is genocide, whatever those things are, you guys did it too, but you didn't do it under these international norms that you've since developed and in this more sort of enlightened international moral normative framework.
Right. To which I typically say, well, sorry, tough luck, but that's just sort of how it works. But, I can at the same time understand.
That seems to be an outstanding issue for both China and, well, actually, it's not just China and Russia, but let's just focus on China and Russia, which is there seems to be increasingly in the last, how many years, not sure, at least 10 years, it's been a prominent lament. There has been this kind of like anger directed at the U.S. in particular for what these countries see as a kind of hypocrisy. And actually, this kind of runs through really the last 20 years, because I think Iraq and the Iraq War was such a big part of what informed maybe China and both China and Russia's accelerated attempts to develop their own defense posture, their militaries to invest in national security. How accurate is all of that? I didn't really form a coherent question, but do we often, I guess the coherent question would be, Kaiser, are we Americans really deeply unaware of just how threatening we are and how much our own language and the way that we talk about ourselves and our own exceptionalism doesn't sync up with the way in which we are perceived globally?
Yeah, so there was a phrase that was coined pretty recently, but it's not a politically correct phrase to use anymore. But it was Edward Luttwak who called it something like great power autism. I wouldn't use that phrase, obviously, because I think that, you don't use words like that anymore. But the idea, it's clear, right? When you are a big blundering great power, you become sort of insensitive to what things look like from the other side. And yeah, America is absolutely guilty of that. So too are basically any great power that's ever, risen up. It seems sort of to be the inevitable fate that they become just unself-conscious and unable to exercise that kind of security dilemma sensibility, that cognitive empathy to see how what we say and what we do looks from the other side. And yeah, of course, we look extraordinarily threatening from China or from Russia, or from the perspective of many, many other countries who feel, the sharp end of American power. For example, have 800 or more military bases around the world, many of which, if you look at a map of them, seem to be encircling China. China has 2 military bases, and only one of them is actually operational right now. So it feels like there's incredible hypocrisy, when they talk about the China threat, because, viewed from China, the threat looks very much to be one that emanates from the United States. And I think that's something we just need to, habituate ourselves into thinking about. We just always need to think about, and because it doesn't come instinctively to us, we need to consciously do it. What do we look like viewed through our counterparties' windows, from behind their eyes?
Yeah, that's something I really want to talk to you about. I also think this conversation right here about how we are perceived, and somewhere in all of this, I feel like a lot of nuance is lost, because I completely agree that, and that's why I brought it up, that we need to and don't spend enough time thinking about how we are perceived and our actions and the hypocrisy of the Iraq War and all the things that we could talk about, the drone strikes, the mismatch between our rhetoric, our human rights rhetoric, and so many of the things that we've done in support of American empire. You could call it hegemony. I call it empire. And at the same time, I think that it's very easy to also take the other, sort of go to the other extreme and say, and become sort of self-loathing. A lot of Americans do that. And to look at the encirclement that you talk about, forward deployed U.S. military bases or NATO on Russia's border, and say that, well, we drove Russia into Ukraine, or we're going to cause China to take over Taiwan because we're so militaristic. And yet, I think that also kind of really misstates what's happening. Because I don't think that the U.S., first of all, NATO, while it has expanded its role, it was kind of rudderless after the end of the Cold War. It went out of the European theater in some of its missions. It's really not had a purpose without an enemy, and that is true. And one can see how the Russians would see NATO as a threat. At the same time, it's not really clear that NATO was a threat or should have been seen as a threat to Russia, insofar as it was that, I think, and the same thing is true with China. I feel like the U.S. policy towards China, let's focus there, but I think this is also true for Russia, attempted to try and bring these countries into the international order that it had crafted and whose values it sort of helped to instill. And understanding, of course, that we have different cultures and all of that. But I do think there was a good faith attempt on the part of the U.S., both with Russia and with China, to try and do this. Again, really imperfect question, but you're the perfect person to do this too, because you're a podcast host. So what do you think of that? Like, do you see the kind of issue that I'm talking about here, this inability to really grasp the nuance of like what the American imperial project attempted to be in all of its blundering and mistakes, and what the reaction has been, and how much of that is because of us and how much of that is because of, quote, them?
Yeah, I think you've captured exactly the same kind of conundrum that I'm constantly dealing with. I feel exactly the same, that we don't want to strip countries like Russia of agency. Ultimately, February 24th was a decision undertaken by Vladimir Putin, and he did not have to do that. There's in no sense did we push him through expansion of NATO so that he had no choice but to. He always had a choice. The blame lies squarely with him for actually taking it to that level. Does that mean that none of the national security concerns that he raised were without merit? Of course not. It doesn't mean that. I think that it's possible to go back and, game this out and see a way where, might have been scenario, we might have been able to placate without surrendering anything, meaningful, without depriving Ukraine of, meaningful sovereignty in any way, and avoid the horrors that have since ensued. I mean, turning Russia into this really quite dangerous pariah state now. I mean, this is not a good situation. But to say that almost is to invite people to assume that then what you then mean is that this wasn't Russia's fault. I think it's possible. And the nuance you're looking for is one where you can still lay the blame so squarely on Vladimir Putin's shoulders and still think that, maybe Jack Matlock does have some points. And the same, I think, is true for China. I don't mean to suggest that there's a straight line that you can draw between the two and that these are exactly parallel situations. They are absolutely not. But if China decides, God forbid, to actually make a move on Taiwan, I hope that nobody ever finds me saying, they were pushed into it and they were left with no choice. I don't think that's ever going to be the case. It's still going to be, ultimately a choice.
Well, Taiwan is definitely something I want to talk to you about. And if I didn't already mention this, I do, of course, want to talk about the 20th Party Congress. But I actually want to stay on this sort of larger philosophical discussion for a bit. It seems to me that just like NATO was rudderless after the end of the Cold War, the U.S. was, maybe rudderless is not quite the term. There was this New World Order conception that was put forward by the first Bush administration, H.W. Bush, back in the early 1990s. And this attempt to build this neoliberal world order under American hegemony, where the American military would be the global police force, and that American-led Western international institutions would form the backbone of a new international technocracy. Of course, that didn't work for all reasons that we can understand today, but for a period of time, there was a lot of hope around that. And yet there was something about it that just didn't really, I think, compel people, inspire people somehow to really give America a clear sense of who we are. What do we want our role in the world to be? And it seems, I'm afraid and I'm worried about, and this is something I want to ask you as well, it seems that we have a hard time really defining ourselves without an enemy. And that might also be a human thing, the need for some opposite, someone to measure ourselves up against. And it seems that increasingly our focus has fallen on China. And again, I would not say that that is, quote, our fault. I think that actually, in a recent conversation with Susan Shirk, you guys talk about this, and I think there's an interesting, really, conversation here to have between what she calls overreach and then our subsequent overreaction. And the thing that I think we have to come to terms with here in America, and we haven't yet, and this is part of what our larger cultural conversation here that we're having that's also spilling out into our political conversation is who do we want to be as a country? Like, who are we? What does it mean to be American? What is America's role in the world? And my concern is that in not properly answering that question and answering it truthfully and being honest about what we really want, which is, I think, not a war with China, we might end up finding ourselves in a global world war that has really awful implications that no one is really willing to really imagine because it would be so horrific. Yeah.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. We are lacking what my very good friend Jessica Chen Weiss described in a recent Foreign Affairs article as an affirmative vision for who America wants to be in the world. It's funny. I think we are casting about for that question at the very same time that China is doing the same. It's trying to figure out what it wants to be in the world. We're not having, you're right, a particularly honest conversation about that. And even for people who do have clear ideas of it, who are willing to articulate those, they're not necessarily affirmative visions, but any vision at all, they're quite diametrically opposed, right? I think that if you wanted to look for the American center of gravity and what it wants among sort of American elites, they won't say the quiet part out loud, but they still want something that is broadly hegemonic, where America is still sort of the global guarantor, where the order is still essentially monopolar, where Europe doesn't really have meaningful strategic autonomy, where we basically call the shots, and that includes in the Western Pacific. Now, we're in a strange place because, of course, China benefited immensely from that so-called rules-based international order. I mean,
if not more than anyone.
I would say more than anyone in terms of just calculated by the sort of sheer benefit brought to society. And the Chinese leadership is not unaware of this. This is why they have never been so disruptive to it. They've never tried to overturn it. I think that people who see them as being, this real revisionist power, I think they're exaggerating. I think that they have wanted to make changes to that order, and many of them are quite fair. And many of them are by the rules themselves of the Bretton Woods institutions. That, it matters, your representation at the World Bank or at the IMF. What matters is your GDP size, the volume of your economy, and your representation should be sort of commensurate with that. That's what's written in the rules. And American, hesitance to sort of grant that to China, to give China a seat at the table in terms of, setting international technology standards and things like that. That's been a big source of friction. And China is not wrong to see the United States as, sort of deliberately trying to hold on to that. Maybe that's what powers do.
Do you think that's ironically because of their economic heft? In other words, that they are a potential peer competitor? Or is it more because of the illiberal nature of the Chinese ruling party apparatus?
I think it's a combination of the two, but I think we place too much explicit emphasis on the latter, and we don't admit the extent to which the former actually does drive our decision-making. It's this basic dynamic, and it's something that I've talked about quite a bit, but look, when you have a peer competitor, when the new kid shows up and is, your romantic rival, you find fault with him. You find other reasons to justify the deeply emotional discomfort that you feel at his arrival. That's just sort of how humans are, whether at an individual level or sort of at a national level. We don't like it. It bothers us, especially in China's case, because its arrival as a peer competitor seems to have violated what we thought of as sort of these laws of physics. You weren't supposed to be able to have a robust market economy and to have an authoritarian political system. You weren't supposed to be able to innovate unless you were doing so under auspices of individual freedom. So when it does that, it makes us even more sort of eager to find sort of moral failings that we can. So this must be because China is cheating, right? It must be because China is not playing by the rules.
And yet we did see something similar in the 1950s with the real anxiety in American society around the strength of the Soviet economy and the advancements that they were making on a technological and scientific basis and an industrial basis. And those fears ended up being vastly exaggerated.
Right.
Partly because they served the industrial complex, the military-industrial complex, and the hawks in government and the Cold Warriors, but also just mostly because we were wrong. We just didn't understand really just how difficult it is to innovate on that level sustainably.
That's right. And I think we're making some of the same mistakes with China, both, in underestimating and in overestimating. I think that there's not a very realistic picture. I mean, this is something that I've been talking about for a couple of years now, but Demetri, if you think about these beliefs we used to have about the relationship between technology and political authoritarianism, if you just go back 10 years, we were still at that point, before sort of the end of the Arab Spring, at least, before the Snowden revelations, we were pretty convinced that the advent of global internet access, and especially of social media, is going to be the death knell to political authoritarianism the world over, right? You couldn't have opened to the op-ed section of any American newspaper in, say, the year 2008 and not seen this basically written, this idea that, Facebook and Twitter are going to bring down totalitarian regimes.
It was during the period of the Arab Spring as well.
That's right.
Around that time.
And then, suddenly, by 2015, 2016, our tune had completely changed. Suddenly, technology is the handmaiden of authoritarianism. Like on a dime, that whole narrative switched. And it's easy to see some of the reasons why. Like I said, the Snowden revelations, the failure of the Arab Spring uprisings, as you noted, but also things like Russian election meddling, the Cambridge Analytica scandal,
I think
all
also the
these things
power, also,
of the platforms.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Gillian Tett has a great, she was on this podcast twice before, and it may have been
Yeah,
the
she's
first
great,
time.
yeah.
Yeah, she's fantastic. And I think it was actually on her first appearance that we talked about this, and she said, this was back in 2017, I think, or early 2018, which is that Silicon Valley was beginning to resemble Wall Street in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis, that
Absolutely.
people's feelings about Silicon Valley and this, cadre of elites and with their transhumanist philosophies and their increased power in not just taking over media companies, but also in telling people what they should or should not do, et cetera.
Right. They had this sort of, Nietzschean Ubermensch mentality that they were above morality.
But you brought up Star Trek, the cons,
right,
the Supermen.
Exactly. So let's put a pin in that too, because I want to come back to talking about this connection between Wall Street and Silicon Valley and why that American pathology really is driving a lot of what China is trying to do right now. Let's put a pin in that and come back. But I want to look at another one of these major narratives. So we've talked a little bit about the emancipatory narrative and how that completely flipped. There's another major narrative that we've had, and that's the one about innovation, right? The one that you're not supposed to be able to innovate. If you go back to like 2012, 2013, and I think this is really conspicuous during the spring of 2014 when Biden was going around making these graduation speeches and talking about America's permanent advantage in innovation because we are free, we will always be more innovative than them. And then you had like Carly Fiorina the next year when she was the CEO of HP, for Christ's sake, she should know better, saying, show me one thing China has innovated, they can't innovate. It was this real hubris. Mm-hmm. And then you fast forward a couple of years later and suddenly China is this unstoppable tech juggernaut that's going to eat our lunch and it's going to, out-innovate us in everything. That narrative had also completely inverted. And they happened at the same time. And I think it's not unrelated that these two narratives flipped for us. And this goes back to, what we were saying about the anxiety that we feel. But I'm using this to illustrate the point that we swing wildly and often at the same time between under and overestimating China's capabilities.
That's so interesting. I wonder how much of that is, though, a reflection of internecine political conflict in the U.S. and a political opportunity to harness the power of those who feel disaffected, who feel like they did not participate equally in the spoils of empire. This brings us back to the conversation about American empire and what has made it so unsustainable. And Michael Pettis, who's been on the podcast before, has done a great job of talking about this, which is that there's no doubt that globalization has been enormously beneficial on the whole and has lifted many other people around the world out of poverty and to a higher economic station. But it's also exacerbated internal inequalities and wealth and power distribution within countries. And I think also something that's not talked about is because the U.S. doesn't have this more integrated cultural, political idea of itself as an imperial power, the way the Brits did, for example, there isn't this cultural, benefit that comes from being an empire, something that, in a more extreme example, the South used to keep poor whites in positions of supporting the system, even though they owned no slaves. Yeah, even though they owned no slaves, a similar kind of thing.
Very good analogy.
So feel free to address either of those. That point, the last point, or the point about the narrative flip and how much of it really just reflects this cumulative effect and now taking advantage of disaffected groups for political gain.
Well, let's put a pin in this one too, and I will talk about it, but because I think you've just hit on another element in understanding what China is trying to do, what Xi Jinping has been trying to do in recent years. And a lot of it can be understood as precisely this desire to avoid populist uprising in China, or to prevent the emergence of populism. And that's what you're talking about here when you're talking about trade wars and class wars. We're talking about, the losers of globalization. And absolutely, this is, I think anyone would have to be just profoundly naive to deny that this was a big driver in the emergence of 2016 in Brexit and in Trump's election. Everything that we've seen around the world, whether it's in Hungary and Poland or in Brazil or all over the place. Yeah, the populism is absolutely a consequence of the unequal distribution of the fruits of globalization. And so, yeah, the other idea that you raised, this idea that, without this kind of self-conscious, explicit sense of reaping the fruits of American imperium. I think that weirdly, we kind of used to do that. I mean, there was that period of triumphalism, the kind of end of history period where maybe we did have that, and that was part of what managed to keep that kind of populist unhappiness at bay for as long as we did, because globalization was already unequally distributing fruits from the get-go. There were already major losses of jobs in West Virginia, in Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and Wisconsin because of, outsourcing. Look, I mean, it was in 1992 that Ross Perot was talking about the giant sucking sound, right? Look, it's not a new phenomenon, but we didn't see the eruption of it until 2016. And maybe it's, as you say, that we did have this. I mean, if you look at, W. Bush's second inaugural, when he talked about that, he really did make an American mission statement. He really did talk about, it was really during that time that we came to kind of embrace American exceptionalism without embarrassment. We really did. I mean, to the point where even today, people who would deny that America is in some sense exceptional are pilloried in our national discourse, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think that we do have a little bit of that imperium sense.
I remember feeling that way as a college student in the lead up to the Iraq War. I was one of those people that felt very much that we're not exceptional. And I think also I was a bit too extreme in my willingness to criticize the United States and lay all the blame at the feet of America. I was one of those people who looked at the 9/11 attacks and said, like, look, we brought this on to ourselves. And absolutely, right. America played a role in that. There's no doubt, right? But again, that loses the nuance and puts the blame on one side where I think actually it's, again, the case of Russia invading Ukraine is different, I would argue, than the case of the 9/11 hijackers in terms of apportioning blame, for example, to the United States. And it's just different in terms of what the increasingly complicated set of factors that led to the 2001 attacks. But those attacks transformed the direction of American foreign policy. The 9/11 attacks, and then that was cemented in the Iraq War. And actually, I want to quote a passage of a speech that you recently delivered at Wake Forest University, Kaiser, on this subject, and then move us to the second part of our conversation, because I think this is very interesting and it resonated with me, and I think it's going to resonate with a lot of people. You write, quote, "We are approaching, if not indeed already in, a crisis moment. In many ways, it feels like the early months of 2003 all over again, with this drumbeat towards something that I fear will dwarf the Iraq invasion." And then you continue and say, "There is in Washington a frighteningly familiar drumbeat now that's pulling us towards war, conditioning us somehow to accept both its inevitability and its moral imperative." And then again, you continue and you end by saying, "So we sleepwalk inexorably towards conflagration." We've talked about a lot of things in this first part of our conversation, Kaiser, that I have said that I want to continue, and I want to talk about, again, the Party Congress is one of those things. But when we get to the other side of this conversation, I want to ask you very much what it is that you see today that makes you feel like we are in such a crisis moment, because I would certainly agree that the tenor of our conversation, the ease with which we're talking about war, is something that gives me a great deal of concern, and I know that it concerns a lot of other people, whether we're talking about China or we're talking about Russia. And the fact that we have these two things going on simultaneously makes it even more concerning. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation with Kaiser, as well as the episode transcripts and intelligence reports, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library, where you can also become a premium subscriber today. Kaiser, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to full episodes, transcripts, and intelligence reports, which include additional notes, resources, links, and other material that will help you get the most out of each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website at hiddenforces.io/subscribe. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation on Twitter at hiddenforcespod, or send me an email at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.